Up next, a conversation on inflation and the debt ceiling with Semafor's business and technology editor, Gina Chon.
Hello and welcome, everyone. We're lucky to have some familiar faces in Washington on this subject on the stage with us. To the farthest near the podium is Michael Strain, Director of Economic Policy Studies at
Not the furthest left.
American, no, not ideologically, I will say, from the American Enterprise Institute. Right. We have Doug Holtz-Eakin, President of the American Action Forum, and Maya MacGuineas next to me, President of the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget. And hopefully we will be joined soon by Roger Ferguson, who is the former Vice Chair of the Federal Reserve and the Chief Investment Officer of Red Cell. Oh, there is Roger. Hi, Roger. Thank you for joining us. So we're having this conversation at actually a really timely moment. We just got the latest consumer price index figures out for last month, and it showed that inflation is slowing, still not anywhere close to the Fed's 2% target, but it's actually trending in the right direction. We've seen the personal consumption expenditures index, the Fed's preferred measure of inflation, also slowing in the latest figures we've gotten from the government. The latest jobs report was actually in a bit of a sweet spot. It is slowing, but still pretty decent for this point in the cycle, and more people are entering the workforce. So, Roger, I wanted to start with you, having been at the Fed in a very senior position. Where do you think the inflation fight is at right now? Is what the Fed doing, is it actually working, even if they started too slowly, as many critics contend they have? Or at the next meeting, should they be in a one and done position?
Well, look, thank you very much for the question. I think what we've heard from Fed speakers is that they are, frankly, at an inflection point. We heard from Austin Goolsbee, I think yesterday or the day before, that maybe it's time to take a pause. He didn't say those words exactly, but that was the implication. We've heard from other Fed speakers, Susan Collins and others, suggesting that it's time to do at least one more tightening. And we've heard from at least one person saying that the move back to lower inflation is slower than they'd like. So I think they are at a crossroads, reflecting, as you point out, that inflation is certainly coming down, but very slowly. The job market continues to be relatively tight. And at the same time, we have uncertainty about credit conditions and the fallout from the banking challenges. And so I think it's going to be a very interesting couple of meetings for them to figure out, do they keep going, do they stop, and what do they say? So it's a very, very challenging time. And we've heard different comments from different policymakers.
Are you worried about them declaring victory too early, especially after, possibly starting too late, that they could sort of get it wrong on both ends of the spectrum?
Sorry. I'm sorry, was that question? I can't hear. Was that question addressed to me or?
Yeah, Roger. I was asking if there's a danger of the Fed declaring victory too early. Sorry, I think we're having some technical difficulties, so I'll take that to Michael instead. And Michael, I also wanted to get a sense from you, aside from where the Fed is on this spectrum, what do you think are the blind spots that could emerge? We've seen so many black swans lately, from the pandemic to the war in Ukraine, obviously the highest inflation in 40 years. More recently, we've had the surprise OPEC cut had the banking crisis, all these things that, people didn't see coming. What are you worried about the most as the U.S. economy grapples with trying to get inflation under control?
It's an excellent question. Let me answer your first question first. I do think there's a danger of the Fed declaring victory too early. I'm not used to agreeing with the market. The market has been wrong so often about what the Fed will do and what the Fed should do. But I actually think the market has been right about the last two data releases. So when the jobs report came out, the probability of a rate hike in May went from being under 50% to over 50% in the market. That was the right reading, in my view, of the jobs report. The jobs report still shows a labor market that is much too strong and much too tight, and in which wages are growing much too quickly. And then the market reacted to this morning's CPI report, I think, in the right way as well. The headline number looked good, the 12-month change looked good, but if you look at core services, what you see is no deceleration over the last 4 months, the last 6 months, something to that effect. Definitely a deceleration relative to 16 months ago. Slower than in January 22, not slower than in January 23, and that's not what the Fed needs to be seeing. So I think a rate hike in May for sure. My suspicion is that the Fed will need to hike again in June. June's a long way from now. But we have, there's been a lot of focus recently on the trends in the labor market and on some of the longer term trends in inflation measures. And it's true that things are trending in the right direction. But if you look at the level, where are we? We are still in an economy with a substantial imbalance between supply and demand. And we've been hiking rates now for over a year, and that hasn't gotten us back to where we need to be. So some additional tightening is needed. What am I worried about? Your second question. I'm not worried about events. Well, I am worried about unknown unknowns, but I'm also worried about things that we know. And I've been very surprised by how calm everyone seems to be about the debt ceiling. I think
I can fix that.
Yes, we can fix it. We'll fix it right now. It's time to panic. I think that is a situation of substantial concern. I'm more concerned about the debt ceiling now than I was in 2013, more than I was in 2011, and those two episodes were pretty ugly. I'm concerned about commercial real estate. I'm concerned about all sorts of stuff, but the debt ceiling is the big one and the one that will manifest itself most the soonest.
Yeah, well, so that's a perfect segue to talking about the debt ceiling. And Doug, I know you've thought about this ad nauseum in different parts of your career. How bad do you think that could get? Because we are in a different place from some of the past fights, particularly in 2011 when we saw the S&P downgrade the U.S. credit rating. But back then, interest rates were still near zero. The politics, surprisingly, seem quaint now, looking back.
Bring back
yeah, exactly. Where do you think this could go in terms of, Michael's point that markets are pretty sanguine right now about the debt ceiling fight, but we saw just how hard it was for Kevin McCarthy to get his spot as speaker. Where do you think this could head, and are you feeling pessimistic about it as well?
This feels to me very much like 2011 over again. Both sides are very dug in. Both sides are unflinching in their willingness to go forward. They don't change their positions without some pain. So, I think this plays out a lot like that, which is we tiptoe up to the X date. We see a lot of financial volatility. God forbid we actually somehow miss a payment. But short of that, at some point they will all rush into the House and the Senate in their pajamas and they voice vote a suspension. That'll be it.
But do you think there will be a lot of pain before that happens? I mean, we saw, in 2011,
We
downgrade.
can see the same thing. We can see
Yeah.
a spike in rates. We see a downgrade. And all of that's on the table at this point. I really don't. I don't see a path forward without something like that to change, to reset the initial conditions. They're not prepared to make a deal.
Yeah. And Maya, you're another person who's thought about this and the U.S. fiscal picture is also different from 2011. I just saw Steve Ratner's charts about, the debt to GDP ratio, where interest payments are for the U.S. government now that interest rates have risen. What does that do for the debt ceiling fight and the sort of wherewithal that the U.S. government has to contend with it?
So I'm probably slightly more optimistic about the overall debt ceiling than Michael and Doug are.
We can convince you.
And well, but I'm so much more pessimistic on everything. Like everything else is terrible. And the way I see it is that
Bright spot.
Yes.
there is a higher percentage point chance that we will default than there has ever been, and that's terrifying. And I would put it in double digits.
Really?
Last night I decided it was 11%. That's where I am right now. I don't know where you all are. That's absurd.
We did a panel yesterday. She was at like 7. So
I know. It was a bad night.
Overnight.
Did a town hall meeting for someone. That's right. But I think the polarization that has led us to this moment with the debt ceiling, if it doesn't get us here, it's going to get us in other places. So on the debt ceiling itself, listen, there's no leverage points. There's no points where we actually go through and think about what we should do on fiscal policy. We have not passed a budget on time in this country in 20 years. This year we'll make 20, and I'm going to bet that we don't do it on time because I think it's due in 3 days, and nobody's in town. So the problem is that when people talk about we do need savings, it's absolutely true. We are on an unsustainable fiscal policy. Our debt to GDP is going to be the highest it's ever been in this country. The last time was right after World War II. We had just fought a war, but it's going to be the highest it's ever been in 5 years. We're going to be spending more on interest payments than we do on defense. Interest payments are the fastest growing part of the federal budget. This leaves us vulnerable economically. In terms of fighting the next black swan, whatever it is, we know we're going to need to borrow like we did during COVID for something else. It leaves us unable to update our social contract in a way that makes sense for this century instead of last. And it leaves us not ready to deal with all the huge, big changes on the horizons, the disruptive forces that we're seeing from technology and other things. And so it is right to say we need to generate savings, but it is absolutely asinine to say if we don't, we're going to default. We're going to have the biggest self-imposed economic crisis you can imagine. The problem is, where can we negotiate this? And the fact that the Senate Budget Committee is not even going to do a budget and the House Budget Committee is going to do one after the fact leaves us with no good place. That said, I think there's a way out of here. I think there's a deal to be had. And just quickly, I think it has some modest discretionary caps for a couple of years, hopefully some healthcare savings that both parties could agree to, but that may be too much. Yeah, probably not, but wishful thinking. And hopefully a commission. Something that we've seen in the past, like the Trust Act or another Simpson-Bowles, which may work because our entitlement programs are headed towards insolvency in the next decade if we don't make changes. So I think we may skirt our way through this, but that polarization, which has led us to pander on every fiscal issue, failed to address these problems. President Trump borrowed $4 trillion in new borrowing, and Biden has done, I think, 3.4 so far, not counting the good borrowing for COVID, when the economy is so strong and that borrowing is contributing to inflation. So I think they're unable to be fiscally responsible, and I think that will lead to continued problems on this front, which weaken us for all the other important issues that we have to deal with.
So I'll admit that in the last 2 minutes,
Did you get-
I thought the odds of us missing a payment have gone up.
Just from what Maya said.
Maya's
odds
making me
keep changing.
more pessimistic.
Yeah. Well, Roger, if you can hear me now.
Yes.
I wanted to ask you, what kind of firepower does the Fed have versus sort of the moral hazard issues that it would face as, if we come to this precipice, as Doug and Maya and Michael have talked about, they've had in past meetings in 2011 and and other times when they've had this fight, what could they do? There's been some what-if scenarios about what they could accept in terms of treasuries and other things, but obviously you don't want to have the Fed rescuing the government and Congress perhaps in this kind of situation. So what kind of position does that put them in?
So look, I think you point out a very difficult situation. Let me first say that I think we will dodge the bullet yet again on the debt ceiling. I think the crisis is just too unthinkable to contemplate. The Fed has very few tools when it comes to restoring the credibility of full faith and credit for the United States if in fact we end up in a very difficult position because Congress can't move on the debt ceiling. They can obviously solve some problems, but frankly, creating more liquidity does not fundamentally speak to the ability of our country to govern. So I think, to look to the Fed to solve that kind of really big problem is looking in the wrong place. Particularly true given the tools that they've already used and how much work they've done in terms of both interest rates, moving up to try to deal with inflation, and then putting in these new lending programs, the bank term lending program as an example. And so I don't think the Fed really needs to be or should be put in a place where it's got to try to bail out the Congress for its inability to reach decisions. I agree. I think I'm more optimistic than the most pessimistic folks on the panel. Maybe I'm agreeing with Maya that we're probably going to avoid the debt ceiling crisis. I certainly agree with her that we have to think through in a more systematic way the long-term fiscal problems. But I don't think we should put those fiscal challenges and governing challenges at the doorstep of the Federal Reserve. It's not what they're meant to do, and I don't think they have tools to actually respond to it.
Right. So we just have a few minutes left. I wanted to ask each of you, and Roger, since you're just answered, if you could also answer this question. There's been a lot of back and forth about whether the U.S. economy is on the cusp of a recession. Some people say we're already in one. There's been some of the jobs figures, though, that keep chugging along. Even the last one, more people entering the labor market has shown resiliency. Where are you on whether the U.S. is facing a recession?
Well, I think we certainly are not currently in a recession. The kind of labor market that we see is quite inconsistent with recessionary pressures, as you point out. I have said a few times, I think the risks of recession are relatively high. I think more than 50%, probably during the latter part of this year. One, interest rates rising as quickly as they have, and the possibility maybe of over tightening. Then you add to that the uncertainty that's come from the banking crises. So I've said a few times, if there were a recession, and I think the odds are likely if there will be one, it will probably be short and shallow, and one that can be managed. But I'd certainly say we're not in a recession now, and I certainly, frankly, hope that my expectation of recession being more likely than not is proven wrong.
Michael, how about you?
I agree with Roger. I think we are clearly not in recession right now. I think we will be in recession either in late 2023 or early 2024. There's a lot of wishful thinking, I think, about the prospect of a so-called soft landing. The actual economy isn't linear and isn't continuous. The saying is that the unemployment rate goes down on the escalator but goes up in the elevator, and I think that is the right way to think about it. And what you'll see, ultimately recessions are largely psychological in nature. And what you'll see is some businesses laying off workers. And once a few holes get poked in the dam, you'll see a sizable increase in the unemployment rate, and the economy will be in recession.
And really quick, Doug and Maya.
I'm with these two who preceded me. I think the second half of this year, the risks are very high for recession. Remember, when Powell laid out the strategy at Jackson Hole, he made three important points, the third of which was the only real mistake the Volcker Fed made was easing prematurely. They won't. They will overdo it, and we will go down.
And Maya?
So I had gone into, before Silicon Valley Bank, I was really optimistic. I thought we were going to avoid recession entirely. I've been impressed with the resilience of the economy. I think a big question will be if there's a credit crunch, and I think there probably will be. So I think a recession is more likely than I thought before. I think there is a possibility that the Fed will quietly back off of the 2% inflation target and see how that affects things. And the one thing I will say, because I can't stop thinking about AI, it's all I think about, but my prediction is that this is the last time it's NBER that says when there's a recession, and that AI will be predicting it in the future and also telling us in advance. Now the chance is 50% chance of recession or 80%. And because recessions are self-fulfilling, that will change the dynamics of recessions themselves. That's my prediction.
We'll blame it on AI. Thank you to our panelists, Michael, Doug, Maya, and Roger on screen for this conversation. Thank you.